Today's story reveals a profound transformation and redemption that began with a simple flight home. It all starts with Marcus, a decorated U.S. soldier, coming back from his latest tour of duty. Eager to enjoy a well-deserved break, he's ready to savor a rare luxury, a first-class seat. But what should have been a moment of peace quickly escalates into a tense confrontation as a fellow passenger named Sarah decides Marcus doesn't belong in first class. What follows challenges Marcus's patience and dignity, setting off a chain reaction that alters both of their lives in ways neither could have predicted. What caused Marcus's composed reaction to lead to such an intense outcome? How did this single incident reveal deeper truths and inspire real change? Stay with us as we uncover the full story, and before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. If this tale of perseverance and transformation resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Marcus exhaled softly, his footsteps steady as he made his way through the bustling airport. The weight of his military-issued duffel bag reminded him of the miles he had covered. His eyes, weary from sleepless nights, scanned the terminal. Around him, people moved in a rush, each preoccupied with their own lives. But Marcus, though tired, was calm. He had just spent months in a foreign land risking his life, and now, the thought of reuniting with his family felt like the reward he had longed for. His steps were slower than usual. His body, after all, had endured things most people couldn't even imagine. Still, Marcus walked with quiet pride. His freshly pressed uniform made him stand out in the sea of travelers, drawing a few glances. But after years in service, he was used to being noticed, though not always for the right reasons. Clutching his first-class ticket, the crisp paper reassured him that this small luxury, a rare gift to himself, was well earned after the sacrifices he had made. His mind briefly wandered to the moment he bought the ticket. He had hesitated, thinking he could spend the money on something for his wife or daughter instead. But after weeks of grueling missions and endless nights under the stars, he convinced himself he deserved this one moment of peace, a brief escape from the chaos that had consumed his life. As he approached the check-in counter, the familiar airport sounds washed over him, the rolling wheels of suitcases, the hum of voices and announcements in the distance. The tired but kind smile from the agent greeted him as she scanned his ticket. "Thank you for your service," she said with a nod. Marcus nodded back, grateful but ready to move on. Gestures like this were appreciated but unnecessary. What he wanted most was to see his family again. He imagined the warm embrace of his daughter and the smile of his wife. Just a few more hours, he thought as he moved toward the first-class lounge, and he'd be home. The first-class boarding area came into view, a sight that brought him a sense of relief. As Marcus approached, his eyes scanned the plush seats. Most were occupied. Business travelers immersed in laptops, older couples quietly chatting, but one seat next to the window caught his attention. Seated there was Sarah, a well-dressed woman in a tailored suit with an air of superiority. Everything about her, the designer handbag, the expensive shoes, the perfectly styled hair, oozed privilege. At first, Marcus didn't think much of her. He had learned long ago not to judge people by their looks. But as he neared the empty seat beside her, he noticed her eyes lock onto him, her gaze narrowing slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Excuse me," Marcus said politely as he stood in front of the seat. "I believe this is mine." Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gave him a once-over, her expression unreadable but cold. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. She glanced at his uniform and then back at him. "This is first class." Marcus felt his jaw tighten but kept his voice steady. "Yes, I'm sure. This is my seat." For a moment, Sarah sat back, her eyes still scanning him as if she couldn't quite believe it. "Well, I find that hard to believe," she said with a hint of condescension. "You must have made a mistake. This is reserved for first-class passengers." Marcus took a slow breath, keeping calm, though her words stung more than he cared to admit. He dealt with much worse in the military, but this was different. He didn't deserve her disdain, not after everything he had been through. "I didn't make a mistake," Marcus replied. "I have a first-class ticket, and this is my seat." Sarah looked around, expecting someone to back her up. When no one did, she sighed in frustration. "I just find that very hard to believe," she muttered under her breath. Before Marcus could respond, a flight attendant approached, sensing the tension. "Is there a problem?" the flight attendant asked, her voice cautious. Sarah was quick to jump in. "There's been a mix-up. He thinks he's supposed to sit here, but I doubt that's right." The flight attendant glanced at Marcus, who calmly handed over his ticket. She checked it and nodded. "There's no mistake. This is Mr. Thomas's seat." Sarah blinked, caught off guard. She opened her mouth to argue, but the flight attendant gave her a firm smile and said, "Ma'am, everything is in order. Mr. Thomas, please feel free to take your seat." As Marcus settled in, Sarah shifted uncomfortably, clearly upset but unable to do anything more. Marcus tried to let it go. He had faced much worse in life, but the sting of her words lingered. Still, as the plane began to take off, Marcus reminded himself that in just a few hours he'd be home. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Marcus gazed out of the window, trying to calm his mind after the tense exchange. Sarah's judgmental attitude had irked him more than he wanted to admit, but he wasn't going to let it ruin the day. He reminded himself that it was just ignorance. He'd been taught to pick his battles, and this one wasn't worth fighting. Sarah, however, wasn't done. Every few minutes, Marcus could feel her glance at him from the corner of her eye, occasionally sighing in irritation. Finally, she couldn't contain herself any longer. "Are you sure you're supposed to be sitting here?" she asked again, her tone sharp, as though hoping to catch him in a lie. "I mean, this is first class." Marcus briefly looked at her, then turned back toward the window. He didn't want to engage in a confrontation, but it was clear she wasn't going to let this go. "Yes, I'm sure," he replied, his voice calm but firm. Sarah scoffed, crossing her arms. "I just don't understand how you got that seat," she muttered, mostly to herself. "There must have been some kind of mistake." Marcus clenched his jaw, feeling the tension in his chest grow. He noticed the eyes of other passengers on them now, watching the scene unfold. He had no desire to be the center of attention, but Sarah was pushing him to his limit. "I didn't make a mistake," Marcus said quietly. "I bought this ticket." Sarah rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed. "You bought a first-class ticket?" Her tone was full of disbelief. "I find that hard to believe." Marcus inhaled deeply, forcing himself to remain calm. He knew what she was implying, even if she hadn't said it outright. It was there, hanging in the air between them, the assumption that someone like him didn't belong in first class. It wasn't the first time he had encountered such prejudices, but it didn't make it any easier to swallow. "Believe what you want," Marcus replied softly, "but this is my seat." Sarah huffed loudly, clearly dissatisfied with his response. She waved down the flight attendant again, this time with exaggerated urgency. "You need to check this man's ticket again," she demanded, her voice loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "There's no way he's supposed to be sitting here." The young flight attendant, clearly uncomfortable, glanced at Marcus apologetically before turning back to Sarah. "Ma'am, I've already checked his ticket. He's in the correct seat." "Well, I don't think that's right," Sarah shot back, her voice rising. "There's no way he paid for a first-class seat." Marcus gripped the armrest tightly, forcing himself to stay composed. He had nothing to prove to her, and certainly didn't need to justify his worth. But the sting of her blatant disrespect cut deep. The flight attendant, trying to defuse the situation, gave Sarah a tight smile. "Ma'am, I assure you everything is in order," she said, her tone polite but firm. "There's no mistake." Sarah, visibly flustered, shook her head in disbelief. "You need to check again," she insisted. "This man doesn't fit the profile of someone who flies first class." At that, Marcus felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. The racial undertone in her words was now loud and clear, no longer veiled in politeness. He glanced around, noticing the other passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked embarrassed, others seemed unsure of whether to step in or stay silent. The flight attendant remained composed and professional, turning to Marcus with an apologetic smile. "Sir, I'm truly sorry for the inconvenience," she said softly. "Could I please see your ticket again, just to confirm?" Marcus sighed quietly, but handed over his boarding pass. The flight attendant inspected it, then looked back at Sarah with a firm nod. "Everything is correct. This is Mr. Thomas's seat." Sarah's face flushed with frustration. She opened her mouth to argue further, but the flight attendant cut her off. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to stop harassing Mr. Thomas. His ticket is valid, and he has every right to be in this seat. If you continue to cause a disturbance, I'll be forced to notify the captain." Sarah snapped her mouth shut, glaring at Marcus one last time before turning away with an angry huff. Her body language spoke volumes, arms crossed tightly, posture stiff, clearly stewing over the situation. Marcus let out a slow breath, feeling the tension begin to dissipate. He nodded to the flight attendant in appreciation as she handed back his ticket with a sympathetic smile. "I'm really sorry about all of this," she whispered. "Thank you for your patience." "It's not your fault," Marcus said quietly, appreciating her professionalism. As the flight attendant walked away, Marcus settled back into his seat, doing his best to focus on the thought of seeing his family soon. He had dealt with situations far more difficult than this one, but it still stung. He just wanted a peaceful flight, but now the remainder of the journey felt tainted by Sarah's toxic attitude. Sarah, though quieted by the flight attendant's reprimand, wasn't finished. She continued to glance sideways at Marcus, muttering under her breath, her frustration still palpable. "I don't know why everyone's making such a big deal about this," she mumbled, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "It's just a misunderstanding." Marcus ignored her, trying to keep his focus on the window, letting his thoughts drift to home. He knew anything he said now would only fuel her anger. She wasn't looking for a conversation. She was looking to feel justified in her prejudice. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus felt the stares of the other passengers lessen, but the unease in the cabin lingered. It was clear that what had happened between him and Sarah had made an impact. For some, it would be a reminder of the small, everyday moments where prejudice reared its head. For others, it would be a moment they tried to forget once they got off the plane. Unbeknownst to Marcus, someone had been observing the entire confrontation from a few rows behind. A man named Robert, a prominent businessman known for his philanthropic efforts, had quietly watched the exchange unfold. Dressed casually, he had boarded unnoticed, slipping into his seat without drawing much attention. As Robert watched Sarah's escalating behavior, his curiosity quickly turned to disgust. He had seen people like her before. Those who wielded their privilege like a weapon, believing their wealth or status made them inherently superior. It was a mindset he despised, and one he had spent his life fighting against, both in business and through his charitable work. Though he had wanted to intervene, Robert noticed how Marcus handled the situation with quiet strength and grace. He recognized that kind of restraint. It came from years of navigating a world that often judged you before you spoke. Robert admired Marcus's calm, his refusal to engage in Sarah's provocations, so he had remained silent, for now. But Robert wasn't the type to let moments like this go unnoticed. He was determined to do something about what he had witnessed. Just not yet. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks, Robert continued to observe, formulating a plan in his mind. As the flight continued, Marcus tried to focus on anything but Sarah, letting the steady hum of the plane's engines soothe his thoughts. He reflected on the countless missions he had completed, the bonds formed with his fellow soldiers, and the sacrifices made along the way. The camaraderie he had shared with his comrades was something Sarah would never understand. In those moments of danger, skin color, background, and privilege didn't matter. All that counted was loyalty, trust, and knowing your team had your back. But now, here he was, back home in a country that, despite all his service, still judged him for the color of his skin. The weight of it pressed on his chest, a familiar feeling of frustration. How many more times would he have to prove himself? How many more moments like this would he have to endure? Glancing sideways at Sarah, who was still fuming in silence, Marcus reminded himself again to stay calm. He was almost home, and in a few short hours he would see his wife and daughter. He leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes in an effort to block out everything around him. From a few rows behind, Robert continued to watch, his thoughts racing. He had witnessed moments like this before. Moments where prejudice and entitlement played out in public, yet were often ignored or excused. But this time, something about Marcus's quiet strength compelled him to act. As a businessman and philanthropist, Robert had dedicated much of his life to fighting inequality. But this was different. He wasn't just reading about it in the news or discussing it in boardrooms. He was witnessing it firsthand. The flight attendants moved through the aisle, serving drinks and snacks. Robert watched as Marcus politely declined, clearly wanting nothing more than to be left in peace. Meanwhile, Sarah had resumed scrolling through her phone, her body language still stiff and agitated. She hadn't spoken again since the flight attendant had reprimanded her. But the tension in her posture was unmistakable. Robert thought about all the work his charity had done, helping veterans transition into civilian life and supporting minority-owned businesses. He had spent years fighting for the rights of those who were often marginalized, and now, watching Marcus handle Sarah's prejudice with such grace, Robert felt a strong desire to help him in some way. As the plane began its descent, Robert knew what he had to do. Timing was everything, and he decided to approach Marcus after the flight had landed. There was something about the way Marcus carried himself, his dignity in the face of blatant disrespect, that struck a chord with Robert. He knew that this moment couldn't just pass without some kind of acknowledgement. The plane touched down with a soft thud, and the passengers stirred in their seats, eager to disembark. Marcus felt the weight of the last few hours pressing on him as the plane taxied to the gate. He stretched slightly, feeling the tension in his muscles as the reality of the long journey and Sarah's toxic presence finally started to fade. Across the aisle, Sarah was already gathering her things, her posture as rigid as ever. She still hadn't spoken to Marcus again, and her silence was deafening. To her, the fact that the flight attendant had verified Marcus's ticket probably meant she had lost the argument, but she seemed determined to walk away with her pride intact. Marcus watched her out of the corner of his eye, but he had long since moved on from the confrontation. He had far more important things on his mind: his family, his homecoming, and putting this frustrating experience behind him. As passengers began to stand and collect their belongings, Marcus stayed seated, waiting for the crowd to thin before making his way to the exit. He didn't want to rush. Across the aisle, Sarah shot him one last glance, her expression a mix of frustration and disdain. She had no idea who she had been sitting next to, a decorated soldier, a man who had sacrificed years of his life to serve his country. All she saw was the color of his skin, but to Marcus, her opinion didn't matter. He had spent too many years fighting for something bigger than himself to be diminished by one person's narrow-mindedness. As the passengers slowly filtered out of the plane, Marcus stood, grabbing his bag from the overhead compartment. He gave the cabin one last glance before stepping into the terminal, grateful to be back on solid ground. He was almost home, and that's all that mattered now. As he began to make his way through the airport, a voice called out from behind him. "Excuse me, sir, Marcus, isn't it?" Marcus turned to see a man approaching, casually dressed but carrying an air of quiet confidence. It took a moment for Marcus to recognize him. It was the man who had been seated a few rows behind him during the flight. "Yes," Marcus replied, somewhat cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man smiled warmly, extending a hand. "I'm Robert Jacobs. I was on the flight with you, and I saw what happened between you and that woman, Sarah." Marcus's expression remained neutral, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "Yeah, I remember," he said simply. Robert hesitated for a moment, then spoke with sincerity. "I just wanted to say I was really impressed by how you handled yourself. The way you stayed calm in a situation like that, it says a lot about your character. Most people would have lost their cool." Marcus shrugged, feeling a bit uncomfortable with the praise. "I've dealt with worse," he said, trying to brush it off. "It's not worth getting worked up over." "I can imagine," Robert replied, his tone understanding. "But still, I wanted to let you know that it made an impact on me, and probably on a lot of the other passengers too. What you did mattered." Marcus wasn't used to receiving compliments from strangers, especially in situations like this. He shifted slightly, unsure of how to respond. "I appreciate that," he said, though he still felt it wasn't anything special. Robert smiled, sensing Marcus's discomfort. "Look, I run a charity organization that helps veterans transition into civilian life. We also focus on supporting minority-owned businesses. After seeing how you handled yourself, I think you'd be a great fit for a role we have. I'd love to talk to you about it, if you're interested. Marcus was caught off guard. He hadn't expected this conversation to take such a turn. He had been focused on just getting home and moving past the incident with Sarah. But now, this opportunity was presenting itself out of nowhere. Intrigued, Marcus followed as Robert led him through the terminal. "What kind of role are you talking about?" Marcus asked, his curiosity piqued. Robert explained, "We're always looking for people with strong leadership skills, people who can inspire others and help guide our mission. From what I saw back there on the plane, you've got those qualities." You didn't let her words shake you, and that's the kind of resilience we need. As Robert spoke, Marcus listened closely. He had always thought about what he might do after the military, something that would allow him to continue serving in a different way. This opportunity felt sudden, but maybe that was the point. Life had a funny way of opening doors when you least expected it. "I was planning on taking some time off, focusing on my family," Marcus said, still unsure but intrigued by the offer. "I respect that," Robert replied. "This wouldn't be full-time. You could work on your own terms, but the impact you'd have would be significant." Marcus thought for a moment, processing the possibilities. Helping veterans and minority-owned businesses seemed like a worthy cause, something he could throw himself into. The idea was appealing, but the timing felt sudden. Still, there was something about Robert's approach that felt genuine. "What kind of impact are we talking about?" Marcus asked after a pause. Robert's eyes lit up as he explained, "We're working on mentorship programs for veterans transitioning to civilian life. You'd be able to guide them, help them find their footing, and share your experiences. We're also offering grants for minority-owned businesses to help them get started or expand." Marcus nodded, his mind racing as he considered the potential. He had wanted to do something meaningful after his time in the military, and this seemed like it could be the perfect fit. It was unexpected, but maybe that's what made it so appealing. Robert must have sensed Marcus's hesitation because he added, "Look, I don't expect you to decide right now, but I'd love for you to come to a meeting with the team, see what we're all about. I think you'll be impressed by the work we're doing." Marcus thought about it for a long moment, still processing the events of the day and this new opportunity being offered to him. It wasn't what he had expected when he boarded the plane, but it felt like a door opening to something new, something important. "All right," Marcus said, finally nodding. "I'll come by." Robert's face lit up, and the two men shook hands again. As they parted ways, Marcus couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent years serving his country, and now, maybe he could serve in a new way, helping other veterans and making a real difference in the lives of people like him. As he walked toward the airport exit, ready to reunite with his family, Marcus realized this unexpected turn of events might lead to a new chapter in his life. The next day, Marcus found himself walking into the address Robert had given him, a modest, professional-looking office building in the heart of the city. He wasn't sure what to expect, but as he stepped through the doors, he was immediately struck by a sense of purpose and warmth. The walls were decorated with photos of veterans and entrepreneurs, smiling beside their new businesses, many of which had clearly been supported by Robert's charity. Robert greeted him at the entrance, just as friendly and confident as he had been the day before. "Glad you made it," Robert said, leading Marcus through the building to a conference room where a small group of people were already seated. The meeting began, and as Marcus listened to Robert and the team discuss the various projects they were working on, mentorship programs, grants for minority-owned businesses, he found himself becoming more and more intrigued. The work they were doing wasn't just talk, it was making a tangible difference in people's lives. He could see how his skills and experiences could fit into this mission, helping others transition from military life or start new ventures. When the meeting wrapped up, Robert turned to Marcus with a hopeful look in his eyes. "So what do you think?" Marcus smiled, feeling more certain now than he had when he walked in. "I think I'm in." In the weeks that followed, Marcus took on his new role with the charity, using his leadership and military experience to guide other veterans through the difficult transition to civilian life. He also found fulfillment in helping minority-owned businesses get the support they needed to thrive. It wasn't always easy work, but it was deeply rewarding. Meanwhile, Sarah had no idea of the ripple effect her actions had caused. She left the flight that day feeling victorious, still wrapped in her entitlement, unaware of the opportunities she had inadvertently sparked for Marcus. But as Marcus settled into his new role, Sarah's life was about to take a turn she never expected. Unbeknownst to her, a fellow passenger on the flight had recorded the entire altercation between her and Marcus on their phone. That passenger, a young college student named Emily, had witnessed the incident and felt compelled to document it, sensing that it was a reflection of something deeper. After sitting on the footage for a day, unsure of what to do with it, Emily decided to upload the video online, hoping it would spark a conversation about racial bias and prejudice in everyday situations. Within hours, the video went viral. It spread like wildfire across social media, racking up millions of views and igniting debates about racism and entitlement. The hashtag #FirstClassRacism started trending, with thousands of people sharing their thoughts on the incident. Comments flooded in, overwhelmingly in support of Marcus. This man's composure in the face of such blatant disrespect is incredible. True strength right there. It's 2024, and people still act like this? Absolutely disgusting. As the video continued to gain attention, it caught the eye of major news outlets. Soon the story was being featured on national broadcasts, with anchors and commentators discussing the larger issues the video had brought to light. One news anchor introduced the segment with, "A shocking display of racial bias aboard a first-class flight has ignited a nationwide conversation about privilege and discrimination." The video, now viewed over 10 million times, shows a woman questioning a black man's right to sit in first class, based solely on his appearance. The public outcry was swift and decisive. People were outraged by Sarah's behavior, calling for accountability. It didn't take long for online sleuths to identify Sarah and the prominent marketing firm she worked for in New York City. Soon, that firm found itself at the center of a PR nightmare. The firm's CEO, a woman named Linda Andrews, quickly realized the severity of the situation. Their company, which prided itself on diversity and inclusion, was now being seen as complicit in Sarah's actions. During an emergency meeting with her executive team, Linda paced the room, her expression tense. "We need to address this immediately," she said, her voice firm. "Our silence is being interpreted as approval of her actions." One of the executives suggested, "Maybe we should wait for things to blow over. These internet storms usually die down after a few days." Linda shook her head sharply. "No, we can't afford to wait. If we don't act now, we'll be seen as hypocrites." After a heated discussion, Linda drafted a public statement condemning Sarah's actions and announcing her immediate termination. The statement read, "We at Andrews Marketing are deeply disturbed by the video circulating online featuring one of our employees. The behavior displayed goes against everything our company stands for. Effective immediately, Sarah Ellis is no longer employed by our organization." As news of Sarah's termination spread, the public reacted with mixed feelings. Many applauded the company's swift action, while others debated whether the punishment was too harsh. The incident sparked broader discussions about accountability in the age of social media and the role employers play in addressing their employees' actions outside of work. For Sarah, the consequences of her actions were only beginning. The video had followed her everywhere, and after being fired from her job, she quickly found herself unable to find new employment. Her reputation had been tarnished, and the backlash was relentless. People recognized her on the street, hurling insults and accusations of racism. Her social media accounts were flooded with angry messages, forcing her to shut them down. Even friends and family began to distance themselves, not wanting to be associated with the controversy. Desperate to salvage her reputation, Sarah agreed to an interview with a local news station. Sitting across from the interviewer, her usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by nervous energy. "Miss Ellis," the interviewer began, "what do you have to say about your actions on that flight?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I I realize now that my behavior was inappropriate, she said, her voice shaky. But I want people to know that I'm not a racist. It was just a misunderstanding. The interviewer pressed further. But the video clearly shows you questioning the man's right to be in first class, based on his appearance. How is that not racist? Sarah's facade cracked. I was tired, she stammered. I wasn't thinking clearly. I've never had any issues with people of color before. I have black friends. Her weak attempt at justification only fueled the public's anger. Social media exploded with memes and parodies of her interview, cementing her status as a symbol of entitled racism. Meanwhile, Marcus's story was taking a very different turn. As Sarah faced the backlash for her actions, Marcus's story began to take a very different trajectory. The same video that had exposed Sarah's entitlement and prejudice also highlighted Marcus's remarkable composure in the face of such disrespect. People across the country were inspired by how he handled the situation with dignity, and his story quickly began to gain traction. Robert, sensing an opportunity to expand his charity's mission, decided to make Marcus the face of a new anti-discrimination campaign. The campaign featured a series of videos where Marcus shared his experiences, not just of the flight, but of his time in the military and the challenges he had faced as a black man serving his country. His message was simple but powerful. Treat everyone with respect and dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from. In one of the videos, Marcus sat in front of the camera, his voice steady and sincere. What happened to me on that flight isn't unique, he said. People of color face these kinds of moments every day, but we have a choice in how we respond. We can let it tear us down, or we can use it to drive positive change. The campaign resonated with audiences across the country, and soon Marcus was being invited to speak at conferences and events focused on racial equity and social justice. At first, Marcus was hesitant about stepping into the spotlight. He was more comfortable working behind the scenes, helping veterans and small business owners through Robert's charity. But as the requests kept coming, Marcus realized that his story had the power to inspire real change. During one particularly memorable speech at a national conference on racial equity, Marcus stood in front of a packed auditorium, his voice calm but filled with purpose. The incident on that flight was just a moment, he said, looking out at the sea of faces before him, but it represents something much bigger, something we all need to confront. We need to have honest conversations about race, about privilege, and about the assumptions we carry with us every day. We need to challenge our own biases and stand up against discrimination, wherever we see it. The crowd erupted into applause, many rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Marcus's words were resonating deeply with people from all walks of life, and his message was sparking important conversations about the realities of racial prejudice in America. As Marcus's influence grew, so did the reach of Robert's charity. With the surge in donations following the viral video, they were able to expand their programs, providing even more resources for veterans and minority-owned businesses. They partnered with major corporations to implement diversity and inclusion training, and their mentorship programs for veterans flourished. Marcus had found a new calling, one that combined his leadership skills, his passion for helping others, and his desire to see real change in society. One day, after a particularly productive meeting at the charity's office, Marcus ran into Robert in the hallway. Robert, always quick with a smile, clapped him on the shoulder. "You know, Marcus," he said, "when I saw you on that plane, I knew you were something special, but I had no idea just how much of an impact you'd have." Marcus smiled back, his humility shining through. "I'm just glad I can use my experience to help others," he replied. "Every day I'm reminded why this work is so important." As they walked together toward the exit, Robert chuckled. "You know, in a strange way, we almost owe Sarah a thank you. Her actions that day set all of this in motion." Marcus shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think we owe her anything," he said. "But I do hope she's learned something from all this. Maybe in some small way, this whole experience opened her eyes." By this point, Sarah had become a figure of national scrutiny, her face synonymous with privilege and prejudice. But Marcus's response had elevated him into a position of influence, where he could effect real change. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the most painful moments in life could lead to unexpected and rewarding opportunities. As Marcus drove home that evening, reflecting on how far he had come since that fateful flight, he felt a sense of pride. His journey had been challenging, but it had led him to a place where he could truly make a difference, not just for himself, but for others like him. He pulled into his driveway, his heart warming as he saw his wife and daughter waiting for him on the porch. The look on their faces was all the reminder he needed of what truly mattered: family, purpose, and leaving the world a little better than he had found it. Meanwhile, the public backlash against Sarah had continued to grow. As people dug deeper into her background, they uncovered more instances of entitled and dismissive behavior, both in her professional and personal life. She had become a symbol of unchecked bias, and her downfall was swift. Unable to find work and shunned by those who had once considered her a friend, Sarah's life had unraveled in ways she never could have imagined. In her mind, the viral video had ruined her life, but in reality, it had simply exposed her for who she truly was. Eventually, Sarah found herself working minimum-wage jobs, barely scraping by. The high-powered marketing career she had once boasted about was long gone, and her social standing had crumbled. But in the midst of her struggle, Sarah was forced to confront a painful truth. She had been wrong. The life she had built for herself was built on privilege and entitlement, and it had all come crashing down because of her own actions. Desperate to salvage her reputation, Sarah reached out to a local news station for an interview, hoping to explain her side of the story. But the interview only further highlighted how out of touch she was. "I never thought of myself as racist," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. It was just a misunderstanding." The public's response was harsh. People didn't see a woman taking accountability for her actions. They saw someone making excuses for behavior that had hurt and humiliated another person. Her attempts to apologize felt hollow, and the damage to her reputation seemed irreversible. But as Sarah's life continued to unravel, Robert's charity was thriving, and Marcus's role as the face of the organization only grew. The story of how he had handled Sarah's discrimination with grace and dignity had inspired people far beyond the original flight. It was a reminder that strength isn't just about physical resilience. It's about emotional resilience as well. And Marcus had shown the world what true strength looked like. One day, after months of living in the shadow of her mistakes, Sarah received an unexpected message. It was from Robert, who had heard about her struggles and wanted to meet with her. Hesitant but desperate, Sarah agreed. She didn't know what to expect, but she had little left to lose. When they met, Robert was direct but kind. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened," he said. "I know the last few months have been hard for you, and I'm not here to make it worse. But I think there's an opportunity for you to learn from this, and maybe even help others learn too." Sarah, still defensive, bristled at his words. "What do you mean? Do you think I deserve what's happened to me?" Robert looked at her thoughtfully. "I don't think anyone deserves to be publicly shamed, but I do believe that when we make mistakes, especially ones that hurt others, we have to be willing to learn from them. And right now, I think you have a chance to do that." Sarah's defensiveness faded as Robert's words sank in. "What kind of chance are you talking about?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I run a charity that helps veterans and supports minority-owned businesses," Robert explained. "We also focus on anti-discrimination training, and I think your story, your experience, could be valuable in that work. It could be an opportunity for you to take responsibility for your actions and help others avoid making the same mistakes." Sarah was silent for a long time. She had spent months blaming others for her downfall, but now she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn this experience into something positive. Maybe she could use her story to make a difference, to prevent others from walking down the same path she had. "I don't know if people will believe I've changed," Sarah said softly, "but I want to try." Robert smiled gently, sensing that Sarah was finally open to change. "That's all anyone can ask for, that you try. This won't be easy, and there will be people who doubt your sincerity. But if you're willing to put in the work, I believe this could be a turning point." Sarah hesitated, still processing everything. The months of isolation and public backlash had left her feeling defeated, but for the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope, an opportunity to make things right. "What would I have to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert leaned forward, his tone serious but encouraging. "You'd start by going through our diversity and anti-discrimination training program. It's not just a one-time thing, it's an ongoing process. You'd have to commit to learning, understanding your own biases, and being open to uncomfortable conversations. And if you're ready, we'd want you to speak publicly about your experience, how you've grown from this, and how others can learn from it." Sarah nodded slowly, realizing the enormity of what he was asking. It wasn't just about repairing her reputation. It was about changing who she was at her core. "I'll do it," she said finally, determination creeping into her voice. "I'm willing to learn, to change." Over the next several months, Sarah began her journey of growth and self-reflection. She attended workshops, engaged in difficult conversations about race and privilege, and started to confront the prejudices that had shaped her perspective for so long. It wasn't easy. There were moments when she felt defensive, moments when she wanted to give up. But slowly, as she listened and learned, she began to understand the deeper issues at play. The entitled woman from the plane was transforming into someone who recognized her own biases and was determined to make amends. As part of her commitment, Sarah agreed to publicly share her story. It was nerve-wracking. After all, the world still saw her as the villain from that viral video. But Robert believed that her willingness to change and to speak openly about her mistakes could help others see that growth was possible, even for someone like her. The culmination of her journey came when she was invited to join Marcus at one of Robert's charity events. The plan was for Sarah to share her story alongside Marcus in a joint presentation about prejudice, growth, and redemption. Both were understandably nervous. Marcus, though now accustomed to public speaking, wasn't sure how the audience would react to hearing from Sarah. And Sarah, well, she was unsure if people would even believe that she had changed. On the day of the presentation, the room was packed with employees from Grayson Industries, a company that had recently partnered with Robert's charity to implement diversity training. As Sarah and Marcus took the stage together, there was a noticeable tension in the air. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing Sarah from the viral video. Others seemed curious, waiting to see how this unlikely pair would handle such a delicate subject. Sarah spoke first, her voice steady despite her nerves. "A year ago, I was a very different person," she began, addressing the crowd. "I thought I was open-minded, that I treated people fairly. But one moment on a plane revealed something ugly about myself. Something I hadn't even realized was there." She paused, glancing at Marcus before continuing. "What I did to Marcus that day was wrong, and it came from a place of prejudice I didn't want to admit I had. It's taken months of learning, of listening, to start to change that." The room was silent as Sarah continued, recounting the events of the flight and the fallout that followed. She spoke candidly about the consequences she had faced, the loss of her job, her reputation, and the friends who had distanced themselves. But more importantly, she talked about the growth she had experienced, the hard work of confronting her own biases and learning to see the world through a different lens. Then, it was Marcus's turn. He addressed the crowd with the same quiet strength he had displayed on the plane that day. "What happened on that flight was painful," he said. "But it's part of a much larger conversation we need to have as a society. We need to recognize that biases, whether they're conscious or unconscious, affect people's lives every day. And we need to challenge those biases, not just in others, but in ourselves." Marcus spoke about his experiences as a black man in the military and the everyday moments of discrimination he had faced. But he also spoke about hope, about the possibility of change, even for those who had made mistakes like Sarah. "Redemption is possible," he said, his voice strong and clear. "But it requires more than just saying sorry. It requires real, honest reflection and a willingness to do the work." Sarah and I stand here today, not as enemies, but as people who've been through something difficult and come out the other side stronger. When they finished, the audience erupted in applause. The tension that had hung in the air seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of possibility. People approached them afterward, sharing their own experiences with prejudice and promising to do better in their own lives. The presentation had struck a chord, not just because of the content, but because of the raw honesty and vulnerability both Sarah and Marcus had shown. Over time, Sarah and Marcus's joint presentations became a regular part of Robert's charity's outreach efforts. They spoke at conferences, universities, and corporations across the country, sharing their story of conflict, growth, and ultimately reconciliation. What had begun as a moment of prejudice on a plane had blossomed into a powerful message of hope and change. One evening, after a particularly impactful presentation, Sarah and Marcus found themselves sitting in a quiet corner of a hotel bar, reflecting on how far they had come. Sarah, sipping her water thoughtfully, broke the silence. "I'll always be ashamed of what I did that day," she said quietly, "but I'm grateful for where it led me. I'm a better person now than I ever was before." Marcus nodded, understanding the complexity of her emotions. "That's the thing about growth," he said. "It's painful, but it's always worth it." Sarah smiled, a rueful expression on her face. "I just wish it hadn't taken something like this, so public, so humiliating, to wake me up." "Maybe that's part of your purpose now," Marcus suggested, "to help others learn these lessons without having to go through what you did." As they sat there, a young woman approached the table, clearly nervous. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I saw your presentation earlier, and I just wanted to thank you both. It made me realize some things about myself, things I'm not proud of, but it also gave me hope that I can change." Sarah and Marcus exchanged a glance, both feeling the weight of her words. This was why they did this work, to spark moments of self-reflection, to plant the seeds of change in people who might otherwise never question their own biases. As the young woman walked away, Sarah turned back to Marcus. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that video hadn't been recorded? If none of this had come to light?" Marcus thought about it for a moment, then shook his head. "I try not to dwell on the what-ifs," he said, "but I like to think that everything happens for a reason. Maybe we needed to go through all of this to get to where we are now." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "When all this started, I thought my life was over. I never imagined I'd be here, doing this work, speaking to people about something I was so blind to before." "It's funny how life works," Marcus said. "Sometimes the hardest moments lead to the biggest transformations." As they left the bar that evening, stepping out into the cool night air, both Marcus and Sarah felt a sense of optimism about the future. They had come a long way since that day on the plane, but in many ways, their journey was just beginning. There were more minds to open, more hearts to change, and they were committed to continuing their work, one presentation at a time, one conversation at a time. Their story, which had started as a confrontation fueled by prejudice, had evolved into something much bigger. It had become a testament to the power of education, empathy, and the human capacity for growth. In a world often divided by race and privilege, Marcus and Sarah's journey offered a glimmer of hope. A reminder that even in the face of ignorance and discrimination, there was always the potential for learning, for changing, and for coming together. As they parted ways that night, each heading back to their hotel rooms, they carried with them the knowledge that their unlikely partnership was making a real difference in the world. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of tension and discomfort, but they had learned that those moments of discomfort were often where the most growth happened. Back in his room, as Marcus lay in bed, reflecting on the day's events, he marveled at how far his life had come, from a decorated soldier to a victim of discrimination, to now a catalyst for change. It had been quite a journey. He thought about all the people they had spoken to, all the minds they had touched, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had fought for his country, but now he was fighting for something equally important, a more inclusive, just society. Across town, in her own hotel room, Sarah was having similar thoughts. She looked at herself in the mirror, remembering the woman she had once been. Entitled, dismissive, unaware of the privilege that had shaped her life. The journey of self-reflection and growth had been painful at times, but she wouldn't trade it for anything. It had made her a better person, and it had given her the chance to make a real difference. As both Marcus and Sarah drifted off to sleep that night, they felt a sense of peace, knowing that they were on the right path. A path of understanding, growth, and hope for a better future. Their story, born from a moment of conflict, had become a powerful tool for change. And they knew that with every conversation they had, every person they reached, they were helping to build a more inclusive world. It was a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there is always the potential for growth and transformation. With education, empathy, and a willingness to change, we can overcome our biases and build bridges across the divides that separate us. As the city slept around them, Marcus and Sarah rested, ready to face another day of challenging conversations and transformative work. Their journey was far from over, but they were ready for the challenges ahead. Together, they were helping to create a more inclusive, understanding society, one conversation at a time. As Marcus and Sarah continued their work in the months that followed, their story spread far and wide, touching people from all walks of life. The impact of their message went beyond just corporate boardrooms and diversity training sessions. It became a national conversation about race, privilege, and the possibility of redemption. For many, their partnership became a powerful symbol that even in moments of conflict, change was possible. One of the most impactful moments came when they were invited to speak at a major university. The auditorium was packed with students, faculty, and members of the community, all eager to hear their story. As they took the stage, Marcus could feel the weight of their words before they even began. This was more than just a talk. This was an opportunity to plant seeds of understanding in the next generation. Sarah spoke first, recounting her journey with raw honesty. "When I look back on who I was that day on the plane, I don't recognize that person anymore," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I had spent my whole life not realizing how much privilege I had, how much my worldview was shaped by that privilege. I was blind to the struggles of people who didn't look like me, and it took being publicly called out to open my eyes." The room was silent as Sarah continued, laying bare the painful process of self-reflection she had undergone. "I don't say this to excuse what I did. I say this because I want others to see that it's possible to change. But change isn't easy. It requires confronting the parts of ourselves we're not proud of. It means listening, even when it's uncomfortable. And it means acknowledging that we all have biases we need to work on." Marcus followed, picking up where Sarah left off. "For me, that day on the plane wasn't the first time I'd experienced discrimination," he said, "but it was the first time it had been so public, so blatant. And in that moment, I had a choice. I could either respond with anger or I could respond with grace. I chose grace, not because it was easy, but because I knew it was the only way to turn that moment into something positive." He paused, letting his words sink in. We live in a world where these kinds of moments happen every day. People of color face microaggressions, assumptions, and outright prejudice in ways that are often invisible to others. But just because it's invisible to some doesn't mean it's not there. It's up to all of us to be aware of these dynamics, to challenge them when we see them, and to create spaces where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. As they wrapped up their presentation, the audience erupted into applause. But this time, it wasn't just applause for a powerful story. It was applause for the possibility of a better future. A future where people like Marcus and Sarah could come together, not as adversaries, but as allies in the fight for equality. After the talk, students approached them, sharing their own experiences with bias and discrimination. Many expressed how much the story had inspired them to challenge their own assumptions, to think more deeply about how they interacted with people different from themselves. One young man, visibly moved, came up to Marcus and Sarah. "I've been thinking a lot about my own biases lately," he admitted. "Hearing your story made me realize that I have a lot of work to do, and I just wanted to thank you both for opening my eyes." Marcus smiled, clapping the young man on the shoulder. "The fact that you're willing to have these conversations is already a big step forward," he said. "Change starts with awareness, and it sounds like you're on the right path." Sarah added, "It's not about being perfect. It's about being open to learning and doing better." As they left the university that day, Marcus and Sarah couldn't help but feel proud of the impact their story was having. What had started as a moment of confrontation on a plane had grown into a movement that was inspiring people across the country to rethink how they treated others, how they saw the world, and how they could be part of the solution. Their work with Robert's charity continued to flourish as well. The organization expanded its reach, partnering with more businesses, universities, and community organizations to implement diversity and inclusion training. They launched new programs aimed at supporting minority-owned businesses, and their veteran mentorship program grew stronger by the day, helping countless veterans find their footing as they transitioned to civilian life. For Marcus, the work was deeply fulfilling. Every day, he saw the tangible results of his efforts, from the veterans he mentored to the young people inspired by his story. He had found a new mission, one that allowed him to continue serving his country in a different way, by building a more inclusive, understanding society. Sarah, too, found a new sense of purpose. While the public scrutiny she had faced in the months following the viral video had been overwhelming, it had also been the catalyst for a profound transformation in her life. She had come to understand that true growth required humility, vulnerability, and the courage to admit when you're wrong. And now, she was using her story to help others see that change was possible, even for those who had made serious mistakes. One day, as Marcus and Robert were wrapping up a meeting at the charity's office, Robert turned to Marcus with a thoughtful look. "You know, when I first approached you at the airport, I had no idea just how far this would go," Robert said, smiling. "You've turned this whole situation into something bigger than either of us could have imagined." Marcus smiled back, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for how far he had come. "I guess we owe a lot of that to you," Marcus said. "You saw something in me that day that I didn't even see in myself." Robert chuckled, shaking his head. "It wasn't hard to see, Marcus. You've always had that strength. You just needed the right opportunity to show it." As they stood together, reflecting on the unexpected journey that had brought them to this point, Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had found his purpose, and he was making a real difference in the lives of others. For Sarah, the journey was far from over. She still faced moments of doubt, moments when she questioned whether people would ever truly believe that she had changed. But each day, she committed herself to the work of growth, understanding that it was a lifelong process. She knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew that she had the strength to continue down it. Together, Marcus and Sarah continued their work, traveling the country, sharing their story, and helping to build a world where everyone could be treated with respect, dignity, and compassion. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. As they looked ahead to the future, they knew there were still many minds to change, many hearts to open. But with each presentation, each conversation, and each new person they inspired, they were making progress, slowly but surely. And as the sun set on another day, both Marcus and Sarah knew that their work was far from finished. But they were ready for whatever came next, confident that together they could help shape a better, more inclusive world, one conversation at a time. As Marcus and Sarah continued their work, new opportunities kept unfolding. The story of their confrontation and reconciliation had sparked not only important conversations, but had inspired action at various levels of society. Robert's charity, now widely recognized for its mission to foster inclusion, began receiving invitations from schools, corporations, and local governments wanting to adopt similar diversity training programs. Marcus found himself increasingly involved in designing these programs, combining his military leadership experience with his deep personal understanding of racial inequality. He was invited to speak at corporate events, veterans groups, and universities, but the most meaningful invitations came from schools. Marcus knew that if real change was going to happen, it needed to start with the younger generation. One day, Marcus and Sarah were invited to speak at a high school in a small Midwestern town, where issues of race and privilege had recently come to the surface. The community had been grappling with a series of racial incidents, and the school board had reached out to Robert's charity, hoping their message could help bridge the growing divide. As they walked into the school gymnasium, The energy was palpable. Hundreds of students sat waiting, some curious, some skeptical, others indifferent. Marcus and Sarah knew that these were the hardest audiences to reach, but also the most important. It was here, in the minds of young people, that real change could take root. Marcus took the stage first, his voice steady as he addressed the students. "I know what it feels like to be judged before you've even said a word," he began. "I know what it's like to walk into a room and feel like people have already made up their minds about you. But I also know what it feels like to rise above that, to prove that your worth isn't defined by someone else's assumptions." He told them about his experiences in the military, how he had faced discrimination even while serving his country. "What matters," he said, "is how you respond to those moments. You can let them bring you down, or you can use them as fuel to rise higher." Then it was Sarah's turn. She stood before the crowd, vulnerable but resolute. "I'm not proud of the person I used to be," she admitted. "But I'm here to tell you that it's possible to change. It's possible to learn, to grow, and to become better. But it starts with being honest with yourself about your own biases." She paused, looking around at the young faces in the audience. "You're the future of this country," she said. "And you have the power to shape that future into something better than what we have now. But that means being willing to look inside yourselves and ask the hard questions. Do you judge people based on how they look? Do you assume things about others without getting to know them? And if you do, are you willing to change that?" The students sat in silence, taking it all in. Marcus and Sarah could see the wheels turning in their minds, the internal reflections starting to take place. After their talk, the school held a Q&A session, and one by one, students raised their hands, asking thoughtful, sometimes difficult, questions about race, privilege, and how they could be part of the solution. One young girl stood up, her voice shaky but determined. "I used to think racism wasn't a big deal in our town," she said. "But listening to you both, I realize now that it's everywhere. I don't want to be part of the problem. I want to help make things better." Marcus smiled, his heart warmed by her sincerity. "That's where it starts," he said, "with the decision to do better. Each one of us has the power to change the way we think, the way we treat others. And when we do that, we change the world." As the session ended, students approached Marcus and Sarah, eager to continue the conversation. They wanted to know how they could help bring about change in their school, in their community, and even in their own families. It was clear that the seeds of transformation had been planted. As Marcus and Sarah left the school, they reflected on the impact they had just made. "That's why we do this," Sarah said quietly as they walked through the school's parking lot. "If we can reach even just a few of those kids, it makes everything worth it." Marcus nodded in agreement. "These conversations are tough, but they're necessary," he replied. "If we don't have them, nothing changes." Back at Robert's charity, the success of the school event sparked discussions about expanding their outreach to more educational institutions. The team developed a program specifically tailored to schools, offering workshops on bias, inclusion, and understanding. Marcus and Sarah became key figures in this new initiative, traveling to schools across the country to continue their message of hope and transformation. As the charity's reach expanded, so did Marcus's sense of purpose. He had gone from being a soldier defending his country abroad to now fighting for justice and equality at home. The journey had been unexpected, but he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. Sarah, too, had found a sense of redemption in her work. While the scars of her past mistakes still lingered, she knew that by sharing her story, she was helping others avoid the same pitfalls. Her vulnerability had become her strength, and she was determined to continue using it to help others see the possibility of change. One day, as they were preparing for another presentation, Robert called Marcus and Sarah into his office. "We've been approached by a major media network," he said, smiling. "They want to do a documentary on your story, on the journey you've both been through, and the impact you've made." Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances, both surprised by the news. "A documentary?" Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'm not sure I'm cut out for that kind of attention." Robert chuckled. "Well, you've certainly got people's attention already. This could be an opportunity to reach an even wider audience. Imagine how many more people could be inspired by your story." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "It's not something I ever imagined," she admitted. "But if it helps more people understand the importance of confronting their biases, I'm willing to do it." After some consideration, Marcus agreed. "If it helps further the mission, I'm in," he said. Over the next few months, Marcus and Sarah worked with a documentary team, sharing the details of their personal journeys and the transformation that had come from that one fateful flight. The documentary followed them as they spoke at schools, businesses, and community centers, showing the ripple effect their story had created. When the documentary aired, it was met with widespread acclaim. Viewers were moved by the raw honesty of Marcus and Sarah's experiences, and the film sparked yet another wave of discussions about race, privilege, and the possibility of redemption. The hashtag #ChangeIsPossible trended for weeks, with people from all over the world sharing their own stories of confronting prejudice and striving to do better. For Marcus, the documentary was a chance to reflect on how far he had come. He had never imagined that a moment of injustice on a plane would lead to a national conversation, or that his story would touch so many lives. But now, as he watched the impact unfold, he realized that this was just the beginning. For Sarah, the documentary was both a humbling and healing experience. She had been the face of privilege and entitlement, but now she was showing the world that people could change. Her journey wasn't over. There were still moments of self-doubt, still reminders of the pain she had caused, but she was committed to continuing down this path of growth and education. As the months turned into years, Marcus and Sarah's work continued to evolve. Their partnership became a model for how people from vastly different backgrounds could come together, confront their differences, and work toward a shared goal of justice and equality. And through it all, Marcus remained committed to the veterans he had served alongside. He used his growing platform to advocate for better support systems for veterans, particularly those from marginalized communities. Robert's Charity expanded its veteran programs, offering more resources for mental health, job training, and reintegration into civilian life. For Sarah, the work became about creating space for others to learn and grow, just as she had. She led workshops on confronting bias, speaking to both individuals and organizations about the importance of recognizing privilege and working actively to dismantle it. Together, Marcus and Sarah had turned a moment of conflict into a movement for change. Their story was no longer just about them. It had become a story about what was possible when people chose to face their mistakes, to learn, and to grow. And as they looked to the future, they knew that the work of building a more inclusive, equitable world was far from finished. But they were ready for the challenges ahead, knowing that with every conversation, every presentation, and every new person they reached, they were helping to create a world where everyone could thrive, free from the weight of prejudice and discrimination. The journey had been long, and at times painful, but it had also been transformative. And in the end, that transformation had become their greatest victory. As the years progressed, Marcus and Sarah became leading figures in the national conversation about race, redemption, and the power of personal transformation. The documentary had opened doors for both of them in ways they could have never imagined. Invitations to speak poured in from around the world, and their story became a case study in universities and social justice forums. One particularly significant invitation came from a global summit on equality and human rights, hosted in Washington, D.C. World leaders, advocates, and influencers were gathered to discuss the pressing issues of inequality and discrimination in today's society. Marcus and Sarah had been asked to give the keynote speech, a moment that felt surreal to both of them. They were no longer just two people who had shared a tense moment on a plane. They had become voices for change on a global scale. As they prepared for the event, they both felt the weight of the responsibility that came with this platform. They were no longer speaking just to communities or schools. They were addressing the world. Leaders from different nations would be in the audience, many of them facing similar challenges within their own countries. "I never thought we'd be here," Sarah admitted quietly as they rehearsed their speech backstage. When that video went viral, I thought my life was over. Now, I feel like we've been given a second chance, not just to make things right, but to make a real impact." Marcus nodded, sensing the importance of the moment. "We've worked hard for this," he said. "We've earned this platform. But it's about more than us now. It's about making sure people understand that real change is possible, on an individual level and on a systemic level." When they finally took the stage, the auditorium was packed. The lights dimmed, and the room quieted in anticipation. Marcus stepped up to the microphone first, taking a deep breath before speaking. "When I look out into this room, I see a world of possibilities," he began, his voice calm and steady. "But I also see the reality of the challenges we face. I know what it feels like to be judged, to be dismissed, to be told that you don't belong, simply because of the color of your skin. It's something that people of color experience every day, in every corner of the world. But we're here today to talk about how we can change that." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The story Sarah and I share is one that starts with prejudice but ends with growth. It's a story about confronting your own biases, about owning your mistakes, and about finding a path toward healing and understanding." Sarah stepped forward next, taking her place beside Marcus. Her hands shook slightly, but she stood tall. "What happened between Marcus and me was a moment of shame for me, but it's become a moment of learning for both of us. I had to confront the ugly parts of myself, the assumptions I didn't even realize I was making, the privilege I had taken for granted. It wasn't easy, and it still isn't, but that's the point. Real growth is hard. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary." She looked out into the crowd, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "If I can change, anyone can. If I can confront my own biases, so can you. And when we start doing that on an individual level, we begin to see real change in our communities, in our countries, and in the world." The audience was captivated, hanging on their every word. After the speech, world leaders, activists, and attendees from all walks of life approached them, sharing how their story had resonated with them. Many talked about similar struggles in their own countries: racial tensions, inequality, and the fight for inclusion. Some thanked Marcus and Sarah for showing them that reconciliation and understanding were possible, even in the face of deep divisions. Backstage, Robert met them with a proud smile. "You two were incredible," he said, shaking Marcus's hand. "This is just the beginning." Over the following years, the global conversation around inclusion and equality continued to grow, with Marcus and Sarah playing key roles in shaping that dialogue. Their work expanded beyond the borders of the United States. They traveled to countries where racial inequality was a pressing issue, sharing their story and working with local organizations to implement change. In South Africa, they spoke to groups still struggling with the legacy of apartheid. In the United Kingdom, they worked with schools and government institutions on anti-discrimination initiatives. In Brazil, they joined grassroots organizations fighting for the rights of Afro-Brazilian communities. Everywhere they went, they carried the same message: growth is possible, change is possible, and understanding begins with listening. Their reach extended to more than just public speaking. Robert's charity continued to flourish under their guidance, becoming a global force for change. The veteran mentorship programs that Marcus had helped design grew into international initiatives, offering support not only to U.S. veterans, but also to veterans from other countries who were facing similar challenges in their post-military lives. Sarah, too, found her voice as an advocate for social justice, using her platform to help others recognize their own biases and work toward creating more inclusive spaces. She began writing extensively, publishing essays and books on her journey from privilege and ignorance to understanding and empathy. Her work became widely read in universities and by people seeking to understand their own blind spots. One day, several years after their journey began, Marcus and Sarah received an invitation to return to the city where it all started. A local organization had been inspired by their story and wanted them to speak at the airport where the original confrontation had taken place. It felt like a full circle moment, and although the idea made them both a little uneasy, they agreed. Standing in front of a small group of airport employees, travelers, and members of the local community, Marcus and Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that day. The The very place that had once been the scene of conflict was now a place of growth and healing. "It's strange to be back here," Marcus said, his voice filled with a mixture of nostalgia and resolve. "That day, I never imagined that moment would lead us here. But sometimes, life has a way of surprising you." Sarah nodded, her voice steady as she spoke next. "The woman I was that day no longer exists. I've grown from that experience, but it took people like Marcus and Robert, people willing to give me a second chance, for me to truly see the path forward. Now I spend every day trying to help others see that path too." As they finished their talk, a quiet sense of closure settled over them. They had come a long way, not just geographically, but emotionally and intellectually. The journey had been hard, filled with uncomfortable moments and difficult conversations, but it had led to something beautiful. After the event, as they stood outside the airport, looking out at the city where it all began, Marcus and Sarah shared a quiet moment of reflection. "You know," Marcus said, his voice thoughtful, "when we first met, I never would have imagined we'd be standing here like this, on the same side." Sarah smiled softly, nodding. "Neither did I, but I'm grateful that we are. It's funny how life can change when you're willing to listen, willing to learn." Marcus looked at her, his expression one of admiration and respect. "We've come a long way," he said, "and we're not done yet." Sarah nodded in agreement. "Not even close." As they walked away from the airport, the sky beginning to darken with the setting sun, they knew that their journey was far from over. There were still many more conversations to have, many more hearts and minds to change. But they were ready for whatever came next, knowing that together they could make a real difference in the world. Their story had started as a moment of conflict, but it had grown into a global movement for change. And in that movement, they had found not just purpose, but a partnership that defied expectations. They had learned that growth was possible, even in the most unlikely places, and that with each step forward, they were helping to build a better, more inclusive world. And as they looked toward the future, they carried with them the knowledge that their journey, like the work of building justice and equality, was ongoing. It was a path that required constant attention, constant commitment. But it was a path worth walking, and together they would continue walking it, one step at a time.